My hometown, Coulson, nestled close to family and enveloped by a familiar community, was a tranquil place. In our tight-knit circle, everyone was privy to each other's affairs. I often daydreamed of launching my own enterprise there, leading a simple, fulfilling existence with someone I loved. It wasn't a grandiose aspiration, but it was mine, grounded in the values I held dear: loyalty, diligence, and integrity. As the years passed, I forged a modest path that felt suitable for the unhurried rhythm of my hometown. After college, I met Becky, a woman from a vastly different background. She was the daughter of the local banker, raised in a world of privilege, a far cry from my more humble upbringing. Despite, or perhaps because of, our differences, we found common ground. I established a business, married Becky, and together we had 2 wonderful children. Life seemed to have finally fallen into a comfortable cadence, encompassing my family, my growing enterprise, and a future I felt certain of. But life has a peculiar way of seizing what you hold dear and scattering it to the winds. From a place of genuine happiness, married to Becky, raising our 2 kids, operating a successful business, and deeply rooted in the town I adored, I plummeted into a nightmare that unfolded in a matter of weeks. This is the narrative of how I went from the peak of contentment to the depths of despair in what felt like no time at all. I reside in Coulson, a small Midwestern town with a population of approximately 1,000. The closest sizable community, a town of 20,000, is about 60 miles away, with a few smaller towns in between. We have several convenience stores, smaller versions of big-box retailers like Walmart, and general stores that primarily stock groceries, but also offer sections for toys, clothing, office supplies, and even fabric. We also have a small pharmacy, a local True Value hardware store, a farm supply store, coffee shops, a large local bank, a small credit union, and my computer services business. My company primarily provides IT consulting, selling hardware like computers, servers, and monitors, primarily to clients who want a comprehensive package, including network support. My clientele includes a bank, a hospital, and a school system. My nearest competitor is located in a larger city, although I have clients there as well, often troubleshooting their networks. Perhaps I should introduce myself. My name is Tim Mirren. I'm 30 years old, about 6 feet tall, and weigh around 180 pounds on a good day. Until recently, I was married to Becky Maines Mirren, who will soon remarry as our divorce is finalized. We were married for 7 years, years I believed were good, but apparently she felt differently, blindsiding me with a divorce announcement. We weren't high school sweethearts. We barely interacted in school, moving in different social circles. We attended the same university, but our paths rarely crossed socially. Becky, a local socialite, was the daughter of Ronald Maines, who owned the only bank in town, Maines Federal Bank. He lends to local farmers, the feed store, shops like Ned's Supermarket, and most other local businesses. Most residents here secure their auto and home loans through his bank, preferring to interact with their banker in person, which is why online banking hasn't gained much traction. Even I have a small operating loan from my former father-in-law. Returning to Becky, after we both earned our bachelor's degrees, she suddenly expressed interest in me. I had a crush on her in high school. She was a pretty blonde, with a good height and build, a cheerleader. Meanwhile, I was a quarterback in football, on the offensive line in basketball, ran track, and played center field in baseball. Becky wasn't arrogant, but she carried herself with a certain air. She dated Josh, the star quarterback and point guard, who later attended another university on a football scholarship, and that's where their relationship ended. During college, Becky and I didn't socialize in the same circles. She was a prominent member of her sorority, the largest on campus, while I was more of a tech enthusiast, dedicating hours outside of class to learning about hardware, software, and various systems. My major demanded considerable study time, and I held a job to cover what my small scholarship didn't. My dad managed Ned's Superstore, so we weren't wealthy, just comfortable enough to keep me off grants. To put it in perspective, You could quadruple the square footage of my parents' house, and it still wouldn't be as large as Ronald Mains's primary residence. During the summers, my dad and I would go fishing most weekends, while Becky and her parents would jet off to Aspen, Miami, Hawaii, or Maine for leisure. Do you get the picture? We were very different people who happened to grow up in the same small town. When I returned from college, Becky unexpectedly wanted to date me. It felt like she pursued me, and I never quite grasped why. Yes, I had started my business, but I was working solo. I had applied for a small business grant for startup capital, and by the end of the first year, I was making a modest profit. One evening, while we were both at a bar with a live band, Becky finally asked me to dance. We danced well together. My mom had insisted I learn various dances, so I held my own. When the bar closed, we parted ways with a kiss by her car, and she made me promise to call her the next day for a proper date. I was an only child. Something in my mother's womb had prevented other pregnancies. I must have been a miracle baby. Becky had a brother who left home at 18 and practically disappeared. I don't believe he was particularly fond of Ronald. A year after I graduated high school, my father died suddenly of a heart attack. Mom said he had been talking about mowing the lawn, and after a while, she noticed something protruding from the shed door at the back of the property. Had lost consciousness. And by the time she discovered him, it was too late. The paramedics didn't even attempt resuscitation. He had been gone for too long. Becky attended the funeral, although we had only been on a few dates. I was grateful for her presence at the cemetery. She stood by my side, holding my hand as I wept. She was kind to my mother and supportive of our small family. My mom's house was fully paid for, and Dad's life insurance provided her with a stable income, if she was careful. Thank goodness for that, considering how things eventually unfolded. The old joke about a guy chasing a girl until she catches him rings true in my case. I wasn't pursuing Becky. She pursued me. She initiated our dates, and she led the way in our intimate life. I won't elaborate, but suffice it to say, we were well matched. We began dating exclusively, at least as far as I knew. I didn't hear any rumors of her seeing other people, and we were together 2 or 3 times a week. Some days I traveled to remote areas where large farms wanted to connect all their equipment and home computers to Wi-Fi, overcoming the logistical difficulties of distance. I don't know if Becky stayed at her parents' house on the nights I was away. Oh, I forgot to mention Becky's job. Her major was in women's studies, so she couldn't find suitable employment in Coulson and ended up working for her father. She started as a teller and quickly rose to become vice president of the lending department. Sure, it was nepotism, but she dedicated herself to the role, gaining experience in banking, as her father had hoped. Looking back, I realize I was lured into marriage under false pretenses. One evening before Christmas that year, Becky informed me she was pregnant and asked what I intended to do. Guided by my parents' values, I proposed on the spot. I should have questioned her timing when she and her mother selected a wedding date 7 months after the engagement. By the time I realized she had fabricated the pregnancy, it was too late. Plans were underway, and invitations had been sent. When I confronted Becky, she dismissed it with a shrug. If I left it up to you, we'd never get engaged, let alone married. I love you, and you love me. It will work out. I was enamored with the town's princess. The physical aspect of our relationship was incredible, and I wanted to be with Becky, so I went along with it. Even after discovering her deception, I didn't look back. The wedding was the grandest anyone could recall in town. We even held it on a Sunday afternoon so all the businesses could close. The celebration was extraordinary, organized by a team from the nearby urban area. Our honeymoon was in Barbados, where Becky discovered a clothing-optional beach and spent most of our time there sunbathing nude. Our time together was filled with passion and adventure as we explored the island by scooter and snorkeled in the crystal-clear Caribbean waters. After 2 indulgent weeks, we returned home and resumed our work. After the honeymoon, I hired my first employee, and by the time our marriage ended, I had 3 technicians and an accounting secretary. About a year into our marriage, Becky announced she was pregnant. This time it was real, Our daughter, Connie, was born healthy, and I spoiled her endlessly. 2 years later, Thaddeus, or Tad, was born, and my life felt complete. I was as content as anyone could be. In the 7th year of our marriage, everything changed. Becky suddenly had to work late, many evenings and weekends. I could understand the occasional banking conference, but it had been a slow year, and there couldn't have been enough loan applications to justify all those extra hours. Becky always answered my calls, but I tried not to disturb her unless it was urgent. There were no missed calls, and she never sounded out of breath, but I still felt uneasy. Our intimacy suffered too, as she was rarely home before I went to bed. Many nights, I'd go straight to bed after putting the kids down, exhausted from traveling to meet my clients' needs. Yes, I had more help, but that only prevented me from completely wearing myself out. We were all busy, but I scheduled my days to be home in the evenings, especially since I couldn't rely on Becky to watch the children if she was rarely around. I remember the last time I was intimate with my wife. I arrived home late on a Friday night to find, surprisingly, that she had beaten me home and prepared dinner. The kids were thrilled and chattered with her nonstop during the meal, so much so that we had to remind them to eat. After dinner, we cleared the table and loaded the dishwasher before settling in to watch Shrek for what felt like the 100th time. The kids were so delighted to have Becky there that she had to be the one to tuck them in, and I wasn't even allowed near their room. Once they were asleep, Becky returned to the living room with 2 glasses of wine, wearing high heels and a nightgown that accentuated her beauty and rekindled my desire. We sat together, sipping wine, as Becky whispered her desires for the night. It wasn't soft, affectionate lovemaking she wanted, but something passionate and intense. I worried I might not be able to keep up, since it had been a while since we had been intimate, but I gave it my all and fell asleep deeply afterward. On Saturday morning, I awoke to find Becky already dressed, standing beside the bed with an envelope in her hand. "Time to wake up, idiot," she snapped. I blinked in confusion, wondering where the warm, affectionate woman from last night had vanished to and why she was suddenly hurling insults. The kids were already dressed, ready to head to their grandparents' house. Becky thrust the envelope toward me. "This is where I'll be this weekend. You've got about 48 hours to clear your stuff out of my house. Try anything, and by Monday, I'll have a restraining order filed for emotional abuse and violent behavior. And just so you know, these divorce papers will be filed at the same time." I was stunned. Finally, I managed to speak. "What's going on? Why are you doing this?" "It's simple, dumbass. Josh has come back to work at the bank as his dad's right-hand man, and we're getting married as soon as this divorce is final. We've been back together for months, and now it's time to make it official." She delivered one last blow. "Oh, and since Josh can't have kids, he wants to adopt Constance and Thaddeus. They'll be called by their real names, not those silly nicknames you gave them." She slammed the door behind her. That weekend, I spent the first 12 hours reading the documents in shock. Rebecca, no longer Becky in my mind, was demanding the house and my business. The terms stated I could continue working for the business, but at minimum wage, less than my other employees. She wanted full custody and child support I could never afford, along with alimony, even though her income was significantly higher than mine. Her car would remain hers, while mine was company property, which I could only drive if I remained employed there. She had already drained our joint savings, leaving me with only a few dollars. Eventually, I stopped reading and decided to take action. I called everyone I thought might help. Most of our friends sided with her, but a few old schoolmates helped me load a trailer with items Becky wouldn't want. With no place to stay, I ended up at my workplace, where there was an old building with a small, run-down apartment upstairs. I spent Sunday cleaning, setting up an air mattress, and borrowing some used furniture and kitchen supplies from friends. On Monday morning, exhausted and sore, I took a cold shower, shaved, and prepared to face court. Judge Gavin presided over the case, and a deep sense of foreboding settled over me. He had close ties to the Maines family, frequently attending their events, and likely held loans with Maines Federal Bank. His first question cut through the tension, directed squarely at me. "Mr. Mirren, why don't you have legal representation?" he asked. "Judge, I'm sorry," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "My wife gave me the documents Saturday morning, and I only began looking for an attorney this morning. I couldn't find a local lawyer willing to take my case. I request a delay so I can secure representation from a neighboring town." Request denied. "I find this incomprehensible," he replied with a tone of irritation. "According to the case file, these documents were filed 3 weeks ago, and you were served at your workplace the same day. You've had ample time to seek counsel and submit documents verifying your financial situation. I have no choice but to find you in contempt of court for your blatant attempt to delay." "Your Honor," I protested, raising my voice slightly, "I respectfully object, and I ask that this be recorded in the official court record. I believe I am being pressured into a one-sided settlement that is only intended to ruin me, not to help my children. My wife could have submitted our joint financial records to invalidate her alimony claims, as all our finances were shared. Plus, she's already planning to remarry, so alimony shouldn't even be a factor." The judge slammed his gavel, the sharp sound echoing silence. "You have disrupted these proceedings long enough. You've had sufficient time to respond to the summons. I rule in favor of the plaintiff." He banged the gavel again and left the room without further comment. I sat there stunned. In minutes, I had lost my marriage, nearly all contact with my children, and control of my business. I looked over at my ex-wife, Rebecca, who at least had the decency to look slightly guilty, until she straightened up, her expression cold and smug. "You better get to work," she said icily. "I'm not paying you to sit there like someone just ruined your day." Hatred rose within me, but I forced myself to stay calm, noting Josh's close, unfriendly watch. I realized that losing control could land me in jail, which was exactly what they wanted. Joshua and Rebecca, along with their lawyer, got up and walked out of the courtroom. I waited quietly until I was sure they had left the building. The bailiff approached me, speaking in a low voice. "They should be out by now. Josh's buddies are watching them, but you know the Maine's influence here and across the whole region," he said, glancing around cautiously. "Find a lawyer in the state capital. That's far enough. We support you and understand, but we can't afford to be found out." I nodded, murmuring a quiet thank you. When I finally left the courthouse, I noticed several uniformed officers stationed outside, watching me leave. I headed to my office, my mind racing. Oddly enough, neither Rebecca nor Joshua had shown up yet to flaunt their victory or assert control. Strange, I thought. I expected them to come here right away, gloating in front of everyone. With their absence, I made sure the staff was focused on work, then wrote a check and sent Stacy, our accountant, to the bank to withdraw cash. "Tell them I'm heading out of town to service remote clients and need cash," I instructed. I figured going myself could lead to a block on my account. The funds, unless there's a court order stating otherwise. They shouldn't deny access to the business accounts. Stacy nodded, and once she left, I evaluated my options. There was just enough to cover payroll for the next week, and I wanted to ensure my employees weren't the ones to suffer. I withdrew a few thousand, emptied the petty cash drawer, and left the rest for Rebecca and Joshua. Let them handle the mess they'd created. I walked out, bitterness in my gut and a simmering resolve for revenge. Hours later, Rebecca and Joshua finally arrived, strutting as if they already owned the place. They went straight to Stacy, showing her court documents confirming the transfer of ownership and informing her that I was now just a manager, not an owner. They didn't mention my reduced salary in public, but I knew Stacy would soon tell the others. I kept my distance, giving a polite excuse that I had to visit a client, and left the office. Staying risked violating Rebecca's restraining order, which prevented me from coming within 30 meters of her. I wasn't about to give them any more leverage. That evening I went to a bar owned by a client of mine. As I approached, he gave me an apologetic look. "Sorry, Tim. I can't serve you," he said quietly. "Word's out. If anyone here serves or talks to you, they risk losing their loan terms. I hope you understand." He winked, glancing subtly toward the back door, and I got the message. Going around back, he met me with a six-pack of my favorite beer. "Tim, I'm really sorry. Take this. On me. I hope the Maines back off and let you live in peace." I thanked him, took the beer, and slipped back into the shadows. Later that night, as I returned to my lonely apartment, I found a mattress and box springs left by my door. It wasn't new, but it was serviceable, better than the air mattress at least. I'd have a decent place to sleep. After setting up the bed and putting the beer on ice, I settled in. It was the best night's sleep I'd had in a while, thanks to a decent mattress and a few cold beers. The next day I tried buying groceries at Ned's. At checkout, Ned himself walked me out empty-handed. "Tim, I like you," he muttered, "but I can't stand up to Ronald Maines. He'll close me down if he finds out I served you. I'm sorry." He looked sternly at me, then leaned in and said, "Say hi to your mom." Putting on a frustrated look for the security camera, he nudged me toward the exit. That evening, the groceries I'd chosen were in a wooden box by my car, locked and weighted with steel plates to prevent theft. The key was hidden on the driver's side front wheel. I emptied the box and left it there, figuring my anonymous helper wanted it to stay secure. It wouldn't stop a determined thief, but it might deter an average passerby. I went out of town for a few days to work with some clients, and a plan started forming in my mind. Since I couldn't get what I needed locally, I stopped at small service stations outside town to buy a few cans of fuel, regular gas and diesel, every time I left town. I picked up more supplies to carry out my plan. Meanwhile, Rebecca and Joshua tried to make my life hell. I had to change my phone number because she was calling nonstop. Then a cop confronted me, accusing me of violating the restraining order. I pointed out I hadn't even answered her calls, so I couldn't have violated anything. He told me to stop causing trouble and left. It reached the point where I couldn't even fill up my own company car with gas. I had to send someone else to refuel so I could keep working. My plan finally came together when Rebecca began maltreating my mother, calling her multiple times daily, pushing her to apply for a reverse mortgage. The county even claimed they hadn't received her tax payment. When I called the tax office, the official whispered that Ronald Maines was pressuring him to cause trouble for her. That was the last straw. He couldn't legally pressure her on the mortgage, but he was relentless in other ways, adding needless stress to her life. I needed just 1 week to finalize everything. I planned to act in the middle of the night when only a couple of cops were on duty, typically sleeping in their cars. During the day, I would sneak off to another city to rest in my car, staying low-key. I also bought an old rattling pickup truck from a farmer about 40 miles away, purposely delaying the registration as the plates were still valid for a few more months. He stashed it behind an old abandoned house a mile outside town, keeping it hidden for me. I set my plan into motion after every business in town had closed for the night. I walked around, ensuring all the buildings were dark and empty. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. Well, perhaps a few people. It wouldn't bother me if they did. It was time to act. First, I went to the office and remotely disabled the fire alarms in each business I planned to target. Since these systems were integrated into their networks and set up by my company, I had full access. I left the hospital and bank systems alone to avoid potential federal violations. I started at a convenience store on the outskirts of town, using a brick to break the door glass. I combined diesel and gasoline in a bottle, lit a gasoline-soaked wick, and threw it through the broken door to ignite the inside. The bottle smashed against a shelf, catching instantly. Then I moved across town and repeated the process. As I set fire to another store, I heard sirens. The volunteer fire department had responded to the first blaze, and I couldn't help but smile. Ronald was the elected chief of the volunteer fire department and also on its board of trustees, notorious for being stingy on improvements. Tonight, he'd see the consequences of his neglect. I moved on to a farm supply store. The manager had always been obnoxious, even if they hadn't mistreated me recently. I used 3 Molotov cocktails in different spots to ensure the flames spread. The sprinkler system activated, but because I'd disabled the alarms, they wouldn't sound. I knew the fire would grow faster than the sprinklers could contain it without additional water from the fire department. The sprinkler system was quickly overwhelmed, and soon most of the town's business district was ablaze. I called my old home using a landline, and when Rebecca picked up, I spoke briefly, using an electronic voice changer I'd bought at a toy store. Darth Vader warned her that an arsonist was on the loose and advised her to take the kids to my mother's house for safety. From a nearby street, I watched as, about an hour later, Rebecca left with the children and drove to her parents' mansion. I knew she would go there first, but she was in for a surprise. I took my time ensuring my old house was well lit by the flames before heading a few blocks to my car. When she arrived at her parents' gated community, yes, our small town actually had one with security, she saw their house on fire and her mother standing outside, wringing her hands. Guess who had control over the community's computer and security systems? When the fire started, the security patrol had been dispatched to deal with a false burglary alarm elsewhere. Rebecca stayed with her mother a bit longer before they all loaded into her car and headed to my mom's house, since even the motels couldn't check anyone in due to computer issues. Eventually, I parked the company car at the office, tossed a Molotov cocktail inside, and set it ablaze. Rebecca, Joshua, and her clueless dad didn't know I had canceled the insurance on both the car and the building. I then approached the first fire, where firefighters struggled to contain the flames. Ronald stood by the only fire truck, dressed in expensive white gear and helmet, ordering around his half-drunk crew. With police scattered across the city, no one slowed my path. Ronald's refusal to sign mutual aid agreements left his department isolated, making them look foolish. I snuck up behind Ronald, using a voice changer with a deep, electronic tone. I warned him, "Don't move, Ronald. Your city's on fire. I told you, change your ways, or this will happen again. Even your own home is in flames. Stop being an idiot, or face more consequences." I pushed him into a muddy ditch, leaving his pristine white gear filthy, before disappearing into the crowd, watching the crew's futile efforts to fight the blaze. I returned to my hidden pickup and left the area, moving to a large city 3 states away, knowing the corrupt department might still investigate. I didn't bother with a new identity or try to start a business. I just took an IT job, similar to my old one. After a while, I called my mom from a payphone 50 miles from my apartment, just in case. Mom was relieved to hear from me. She shared the latest. "People thought you might have been in the building when it burned, but when nobody was found, someone suggested you left a resignation letter to Becky and Josh and skipped town. But of course, the letter burned too. Becky and Josh didn't marry. Turns out he was already married in another state. Becky and the kids stayed with me until she found a new, smaller place. The kids ask about you every day when they visit after school." Mom went on. "Third, most of the burned businesses and homes were insured through an agency recommended by the bank. The insurance company took such heavy losses, they waived deductibles. After investigating, they didn't appreciate Ronald Maines, the fire chief, blocking modern firefighting techniques and refusing mutual aid agreements. They actually sued him over it." She chuckled softly. "Fourth, a new bank opened here, giving out loans to burned businesses, which hurt Maine's Federal Bank's profits. Maine's Federal's board of directors is unhappy with Ronald, so he's now on thin ice." She sighed. "Fifth, since Becky didn't marry that creep Josh, she dropped the protective order and wants to hear from you. She went to the judge to adjust the divorce terms since it wasn't finalized. You might still be married." Mom continued. "Sixth, did you know Judge Gavin had a hidden car collection? It burned that night too, now reduced to scrap. Ronald insured the cars cheaply, so the judge lost over $1 million. He's not a fan of Ronald now." She took a breath. "We're looking for a new police chief. The sheriff isn't running again, and several deputies resigned. Becky's parents are looking for housing. Their home was completely destroyed, and with few builders available, it could be years before they have a new house." Mom laughed a bit. Becky's mom even asked if I'd sell or rent my house to them. I thought about it, but told her I couldn't trust them after how they treated you. Ronald was furious, but even the tax man told him to keep quiet. Oh, and they found my tax payment. The tax man got the message when his cars caught fire. People seem relieved Ronald's influence has faded, and their tax issues vanished overnight. Now it seems like the fires are only a worry for Ronald and some business owners. Owners. Everyone else thinks the fires cleansed the town. She paused, then asked, "So when are you coming to see your old mom and the kids?" I grinned. "I think I'll plan a trip home soon," I replied, "though I may need a better car this time. The last one barely made it." "See you soon, Mom," I promised. When I stopped telling my story, I realized I'd survived the harsh terms of my unexpected divorce and managed to take revenge on my ex-wife, her lover, and her father without anyone dying. Only a few volunteer firefighters suffered minor injuries at the fires they could reach. I set my ex-wife's house on fire after warning her to leave, using a voice synthesizer. When she tried to go to her parents' house, she found it also in flames. Afterward, I moved far away and settled into a new city. Still, when I spoke about my hometown and my mother's house, it was hard not to think of it as home. Now it's just a memory. Nearly 3 years have passed since my marriage blew up. My ex-wife, her lover, and my ex-father-in-law seem to have conspired against me. If she had just told me she'd fallen for her old friend, I would have been hurt, but might have understood. But they aimed to destroy me, taking my children, stripping me of my business, and assigning me a low-wage job with high child support and alimony. I felt so alone that I didn't think a fair outcome was possible, even in the state capital, with Ronald Main's influence reaching everywhere. Friends in town helped me quietly, though they couldn't openly defy the powerful Main's Federal Bank. I tried to avoid letting my actions impact them, though some may have suffered indirectly. That night I wasn't sure if law enforcement would come after me, so I didn't hide but kept my location private. Even my mother didn't know where I lived. My company, a large regional firm with centralized HR, kept my personal details confidential. Occasionally, Rebecca's lawyer, or even Rebecca herself, tried to locate me through HR, sometimes posing as my mother. I changed phones and called my mother only after driving some distance. Eventually, I'd text her first to confirm it was me. We'd talk about local gossip and, inevitably, about my ex-wife and her father. After Joshua admitted to being married and left town, Rebecca claimed she was still my wife, begging my mother to make me return. Mom would laugh, saying there was little chance of that. She'd share how Rebecca and the kids often asked about me over the years. I secretly visited home to check on my mom and ensure she hadn't shared my whereabouts. I eventually got rid of my old truck and saved up to buy a reliable car with cash. I avoided loans. My ex-father-in-law's bank marked me as delinquent, which ruined my credit. I didn't trust banks anymore and paid cash for everything to avoid a paper trail. I avoided any transportation that could track my movements, paid cash for fuel, and always kept a stash of cash in different places. After some research, I chose a common car make and color, buying an older, fuel-efficient model. I found clean, quiet, non-chain motels along my routes that took cash, keeping my travels untraceable. Yes, that's what I meant by routes. I have multiple routes I use when I travel. Sometimes I'd add a few hundred miles to my route home to keep my trips unpredictable, just in case my ex-wife caught wind and sent an investigator after me. People might shrug, but with almost my entire hometown, people I grew up and did business with, turning against me thanks to her and her father's vendetta, a little paranoia feels justified. Some, like my mother, still think I should go back to my ex, but that's never happening. I'd occasionally take a week off and head to Coulson to see my mom and kids. From our phone calls, I knew Constance and Thaddeus spent every afternoon at their mother's until she finished her long work hours. Rebecca was stretched thin, managing my old IT business and competing for clients. My mom told me that several of my old clients said they'd switch back to me if I opened a new business. It was tempting, but after all that happened, it didn't feel like my hometown anymore. So, I'd arrive unannounced to avoid my mother tipping off Rebecca. I'd greet my kids by the names I preferred, Connie, Tad, and they'd jump into my arms, excited to share everything since my last visit. Then we'd all hop in the car, including Mom, and drive to a community an hour away. We'd spend the day together, eating, catching a movie, visiting a children's museum, feeding ducks at the park. I'd talk with the kids and catch up with my mom, who'd inevitably give me a lecture about forgiveness. I'd just nod and let her talk. But it didn't change a thing. Mom often told me how sad Rebecca seemed, never smiling, always asking about me, supposedly wanting forgiveness for what she'd done. Yet she never actually asked me for forgiveness, and Mom never mentioned if Rebecca even loved me. One day, I caught Mom secretly texting Rebecca from my phone. My first instinct was to yell, but I reminded myself that she was my mother, the one who had raised me. I took a deep breath and calmly asked what she was trying to do. "Tim, Rebecca's worried you might hijack the kids. She just wants to know they're safe. She's their mother after all," Mom explained. "Well, I don't trust her," I replied. "She's proven to be deceitful, and if she knew where we were, the police would probably show up. Show up in minutes." I held back harsher words with the kids nearby, but soon enough, 3 police cars pulled into the restaurant parking lot where we'd been eating, confirming my suspicions. They didn't recognize my car and eventually left without approaching us. Mom was stunned, realizing that Rebecca had manipulated her. "Becky just wants to know where we are so she can join us and talk. You two need to sit down and figure this out." I shook my head. "Why don't you call her now and see what she has to say?" I handed her the phone, and she put it on speaker. Rebecca's voice came through immediately, frantic. "Did they catch him? Was he arrested? I told them he hijacked my children and took them out of town." My mom looked shocked. She couldn't believe Rebecca would try to have me arrested for visiting my own kids, a right clearly stated in the court documents. Finally, Mom responded, "No, Tim saw me text you, and we left. We watched from the parking lot as the police arrived. Why would you do this to him? I thought you'd join us, not send the police." Rebecca quickly changed her tone, trying to downplay the situation. "Margaret, I just wanted him to talk to me. I thought if he was detained, he'd have to speak to me. I planned to drop the charges right after." I shook my head in disgust, knowing she'd only drop the charges if I agreed to something that benefited her and injured me. Then Rebecca asked, "Where are you? I want my kids safe with me." I couldn't hold back. "Listen, they're safe with me and Mom. We're heading home tonight. I didn't hijack them, and the only threat here is your manipulation. If the police arrested me, our kids would see it was on their mother's orders. Have you thought about what that does to their trust in you? And why would I ever take them from you?" As I drove out of the parking lot, I suspected Rebecca might be searching for us nearby. Mom gave me a disapproving look, but stayed silent. I made one last remark to Rebecca. "We're going home now. You'll have to find another excuse to get me arrested." Mom turned off the speakerphone as the kids started crying, sensing my anger. She spoke softly to Rebecca, then hung up and reassured Connie and Tad, who slowly calmed down as we drove. The whole way, I was anxious, half expecting to be pulled over. I reminded myself that no one knew my car's make or color, but I kept checking the mirrors and made sure not to speed. When we reached Coulson, I took a longer route and circled the neighborhood to ensure there was no setup at my mom's house. Satisfied, I dropped off Mom and the kids, then quickly drove off and returned later, cautiously avoiding detection. I usually rented a motel a few miles from town, visiting the kids each day for a week. But with Rebecca possibly watching them, I drove a few hours away before stopping for the night. I knew something had to change. I decided to contact Rebecca, using the motel's Wi-Fi. I set up a video call so she could see how upset I was, ensuring nothing identifiable was visible behind me. I planned to leave right after the call to prevent any chance of her tracking me through the motel's IP. When I made my first video call attempt, it connected right away, and Rebecca answered instantly. Seeing her wasn't something I wanted, but I knew it was part of the game I had to play. Even after 3 years, she still looked good, though I reminded myself that her beauty was only skin deep. "Tim, I'm glad to see you," she said. "Why didn't you come over to see the kids?" "Because I never know if the police will be waiting for me," I replied. "It seems someone's decided I'm the root of all your family's problems." "Tim, no one's looking for you," she assured me. "The state police and an arson investigator did come around, but they found nothing definitive. Sure, some people suspect you might be involved since you left town, but my father has made plenty of enemies himself. The fire department even expelled him. He can't serve on any boards anymore. Well, good riddance. All I care about is being able to visit my kids, I said firmly. Rebecca's expression shifted slightly. Tim, I just wanted you to talk to me. I thought if you were detained, we could sit down and clear things up. I would have dropped the charges right after. I shook my head. You'd probably only drop them if it worked to your advantage. Even if I got stopped and released later, it would still show up that I was once detained for hijacking. Systems don't bother clarifying if you were cleared. And if you withdraw your complaint, wouldn't that leave a false report on record? Rebecca scoffed. They'd never do that to me. Dad wouldn't allow it. I raised an eyebrow. Ah, the same old Rebecca. Dad fixes everything, even if it's unethical or violates my rights. Then she dropped a bombshell. You're not my ex. We're still married. I frowned. No, I have documents proving we divorced, and that I no longer have any legal rights to my kids. After the fire, I asked my lawyer to cancel the divorce, she replied smoothly. Since it hadn't been finalized within 90 days, Judge Gavin, so furious with my father over the loss of his car collection, signed off on it. I sighed, feeling the weight of it all. Why would you and your father push me to the edge? I had a family, a business, respect in the community, and then suddenly, I lost everything. Prison was looming because you set me up. I had no choice but to leave to avoid false charges. She looked taken aback, as if genuinely surprised. That was never our intention. Intention? Oh, really? My face tells a different story. Why was I forced to give up my kids with no chance to hire a lawyer? Why was I reduced to minimum wage in my own business? You, your father, and Josh all seemed determined to ruin me. Rebecca shook her head, denying it. Sure, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You really cared about my interests. Just to remind me who held the power, you had me in your bed one night, then took my kids the next morning and called me every name in the book. You shattered my world and even tried to evict my mother on a bogus tax charge. No, she protested. Dad would never be that cruel. He'd never damage your family. I laughed, but it came out harsh and bitter. If you'd just told me you'd fallen for Josh again, I would have let you go. But instead, your dad thought that keeping the kids would tie me down, forcing me to keep paying the bills to maintain your family's lifestyle. Rebecca's tone softened slightly. Dad said it would prevent you from suing for custody. He thought this would stabilize everything. Well, it didn't, I shot back. Instead, he spread rumors about me so I couldn't even buy groceries or gas without facing judgment. You both tried to take everything from me, and you even went after my mother. That was my breaking point. I couldn't let you destroy her too. I'd let too much slip. I just hoped Rebecca hadn't taken notes. Giving Ronald anything he could use against me would be a disaster. Fighting to control my anger, I ended the call. I knew I needed to leave immediately. Despite my exhaustion, I drove a few hundred miles in the opposite direction, finally pulling off a quiet road and hiding behind a thick grove of trees to sleep. This was the closest call I'd had during one of my secret visits to see the kids. I stayed cautious, using different phones and even Skype sometimes to see my kids, growing up fast. I finally saved enough to hire a lawyer and paid in cash to discreetly check my marital status and parental rights. Rebecca hadn't been lying. We were still legally married. I stopped the child support deductions from my paycheck and instead sent money to my mom, instructing her to spend it on Connie and Tad, not Rebecca. The lawyer also discovered that the kids' adoption had been canceled. Josh had apparently lost interest when he didn't get the benefits he'd expected. Knowing I was still legally married, I filed for divorce, even though it meant returning to my hometown for a hearing. Despite my lawyer's confidence that the arson case was closed, I stayed cautious. Ronald was still a powerful figure, even if his influence had waned. The day before the hearing, I checked into a small motel on the outskirts under a fake name, as usual. The motel owner knew me and respected my privacy. The next morning, I left any weapons in the car, since the courthouse had metal detectors. When the hearing began, Judge Gavin, yes, the same judge from before, asked Rebecca and her lawyer what they wanted from the case. Surprisingly, Rebecca claimed she wanted counseling and reconciliation, painting our marriage as one big misunderstanding. She portrayed me as a neglectful husband who'd abandoned his family. My lawyer then got her turn to respond. I had been up front with her, even about my night of revenge, though she wisely avoided mentioning it. Instead, she exposed the public details of my initial divorce proceedings, reminding the judge of his own role in them. Judge Gavin looked at me, suddenly seeming uneasy, perhaps thinking about his new car collection. He sat back quietly, listening as my lawyer continued. But when she brought up Rebecca's attempt to have me arrested for hijacking my own kids, he leaned forward, focusing on Rebecca. "Is this true?" he asked. "Did you file a report that Mr. Mirren abducted the children, even though his visitation rights allowed him to see them any time?" Rebecca, looking caught, glanced at her lawyer for help, but he stayed silent. The judge pressed on. "Why would Tim come back here to be with you again? This man was humiliated and ostracized in his hometown. His mother was maltreated too. Why should he want to reconcile? Is it for the children's sake, or for some self-serving reason of yours? Do you expect him to endure the same mistreatment if things fall apart again?" Before Rebecca could answer, her lawyer sprang up, requesting a brief recess and a private meeting with the judge. My lawyer shrugged but didn't object, and the judge granted the break. Both lawyers and the judge left the room, returning shortly with expressions that said it all. The judge looked furious. Rebecca's lawyer seemed ashamed, and my lawyer was smiling. When the hearing resumed, Judge Gavin called an unexpected witness. "Ronald Maines, please take the oath and come to the stand." I hadn't known my father-in-law was present. Ronald strode up, casting me a nasty look, and took the oath with a smug air, as if he owned the courtroom. The judge began, "Mr. Maines, tell us why you're here and what you can contribute to this case." Ronald glared at the judge and started ranting. "I don't know why my foolish daughter wants that pathetic fool back. He's caused us nothing but trouble. I want him locked up and forgotten." The judge banged his gavel, stopping Ronald's tirade. "Your daughter's lawyer indicated you have something relevant to share. Please do so." Unfazed, Ronald continued, "I never wanted my daughter to marry this nobody. When she introduced him, I tolerated it, until Joshua Webster started working for me. I arranged for Joshua to spend time with Rebecca, hoping he'd win her over. Eventually she fell for him, though it's a shame she didn't have his child." The judge interrupted. "And were you aware Joshua was already married with children?" Ronald barely blinked as he spoke. "The plan was for him to divorce quietly and adopt Constance and Thaddeus, just as I'd wanted from the beginning. Mirren should never have wed anyone related to me. I despise seeing him at my table." The judge listened without interruption before asking, "Was your intent to force Mr. Mirren out of town or into prison?" "Prison was the goal," Ronald replied coolly, "so we'd have grounds to keep him away from my daughter and her children." The judge's gaze sharpened. "So you used your influence to maltreat Mr. Mirren, creating circumstances to provoke him into breaking the law, and encouraged your daughter to call him and report fabricated violations?" Ronald smirked. "Yes, Judge. It was my idea. I told Rebecca to call him, then reported him to the police myself. No idea why he was never arrested." The judge nodded, his face unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Maines. You're dismissed." Ronald left the stand with a sour look that deepened as the judge continued. "Mr. Maines, I'm submitting the trial record to the district attorney for possible charges. You misused your power to persecute this man, and regrettably, I enabled it. This is something I intend to correct." Ronald's face fell, realizing his influence was no longer untouchable. He glanced at the judge, who simply smiled before lowering his head and leaving. Turning to Rebecca's lawyer, the judge asked, "Do you have anything further before I make my decision?" Rebecca's lawyer stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client had no knowledge of her father and Joshua's plans. She was as much a sufferer as Mr. Mirren, which is why she requested counseling to rebuild their marriage." Judge Gavin turned his gaze to me and my lawyer. We both shook our heads, signaling we had nothing more to add. Then he addressed Rebecca directly. "I'm sorry, Rebecca, but even if you were misled, it doesn't excuse the way you treated your husband," he said firmly. "You attempted to have him arrested on false charges. I honestly don't see how he could ever forgive you enough to let you back into his life." Suddenly, Rebecca jumped up, crying, declaring that she loved me and needed me back for the children's sake. Her lawyer quickly guided her to sit down before the judge could cite her for contempt. Judge Gavin resumed, unperturbed. "If your husband had requested full custody, I might have granted it based on your treatment of him, but he has shown himself to be the better person in all this. His terms are more than fair. He hasn't even demanded the return of his business. I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff." With that, he struck his gavel and exited the courtroom. In that moment, I felt truly free. Rebecca sat beside her lawyer, sobbing as he tried to console her. My lawyer turned to me, shaking my hand. "Would you like to file a civil suit against your former father-in-law?" he asked. I shook my head. "My kids still need a relationship with him and their grandmother. I'm not going to interfere with that." She nodded, and we exited the courtroom. Rebecca reached for my sleeve, begging me to speak with her as we walked out. She distracted me for a second, and I almost missed a movement to my right. Now let me say this. I'm no fighter. I wasn't a Navy SEAL, an Army Ranger, or into MMA. But I've always loved the quiet man with John Wayne, especially the scene where his brother-in-law tries to ambush him in front of the whole town. I've kept that move in mind as a defense strategy, and as I was leaving, Ronald took a swing at me. He aimed for my head, but I ducked slightly, causing him to miss and leave himself wide open. I threw a short left hook to his midsection, like John Wayne did, and it worked. Ronald doubled over, gasping for air. I followed with a right hook to his face, sending him to the ground. I stood, fists clenched, waiting for him to get up. I wasn't about to target his weak spots in front of everyone, even if he deserved it. Just then, county bailiffs entered the courtroom, rushing in to arrest Ronald on charges of assault. He barely had time to process what was happening before they had him handcuffed, reading him his rights. As they lifted him to his feet, he made things worse by directing a threat at me, then attempted to headbutt one of the bailiffs. That move instantly escalated his situation, adding a felony charge for attacking an officer. Our bailiffs serve as sheriff's deputies. Rebecca stood in stunned silence, clearly unprepared for the turn of events. She, and everyone else, seemed taken aback by my calm resolve. I caught her lawyer's eye and gave him a nod. He nodded back and turned his attention to Ronald, attempting to calm him before he dug himself deeper. I looked at Rebecca. "Rebecca, listen to me. It's over. Don't make this worse by denying me time with the kids. Your father needs you now. Call your mom. Do whatever you can to help him before this spirals out of control." She looked at me, and it finally seemed to sink in. Her expression softened with a mix of sadness and regret, and she turned to support her father as he tried to gather what was left of his dignity. As my adrenaline wore off, I realized my right hand was throbbing. When I glanced down, I saw a couple of fingers crooked at odd angles. The pain hit me then, and I understood. I must have broken my hand. My lawyer saw the look on my face and quickly offered to drive me to the hospital. X-rays confirmed that Ronald's head was as hard as, if not harder than, my hand. Soon I was on painkillers and had a cast on. Bless her, my lawyer stayed with me and took me to my mother's house to recover. The only real downside to the injury was the pain and the need for surgery to set the bones properly. Otherwise, I got to see my kids every day that week while I healed and grew closer to them. I put up with Rebecca's daily visits to pick up the kids. My mother and Rebecca used these moments to try coaxing me back into family life. I'd simply spend extra time with the kids or go for long walks while she was there. After a week, I headed back to my new city and job. Years passed, and my kids grew up. During summers and holidays, they stayed with me for weeks at a time. Sometimes Rebecca brought them herself. Other times they flew in. Eventually, she decided it wasn't worth making the long trip when she'd have to stay in a motel, and it dawned on her that there would be no rekindling between us. We stayed civil for the kids, and I forgave her enough to avoid calling her any names. Several former clients reached out, asking me to come back and reclaim the business. Eventually, I convinced Rebecca to sell the company back to me, turning it into a district office. It was small but thrived, boosting overall profits. My role was to ensure it stayed profitable, so I'd fly into the nearest regional airport each month and use a rental car to visit clients. Luckily, we had a solid local team to handle most day-to-day issues. Rebecca went through a few different boyfriends before eventually settling into a long-term relationship with her former lawyer. They had no plans for children, so they simply cohabitated. Ronald was convicted but served his sentence only on weekends over 6 months. While that might sound lenient, he also had to complete 200 hours of community service. A fair judge let him choose between cleaning the city's ditches or cooking and serving food to the homeless. Apparently, Ronald's become quite a cook, as he kept volunteering even after finishing his sentence. He was also given 5 years of probation. Mom's doing well. She met a new man who's a great companion, keeping her happy in retirement. She adores her 2 grandkids and sees them daily when they're not visiting me. And then there's good old Josh. I'm not sure who tipped off his wife, but she certainly made his life miserable for years. She kicked him out, filed for separation, and ensured he had little income after covering the house, cars, and child support. She eventually lured him back under the pretense of reconciliation, only to tie him to a chair and, well, let's just say she had relations with a couple of his friends in front of him. She divorced him after that, leaving him with little future prospects. As for me, I'm still a work in progress. I have deep trust issues, especially with women and potential in-laws. I date and sometimes enjoy a good social life. There are plenty of single or divorced women out there, most of whom have kids. I try to be a positive influence on their children, but steer clear of long-term commitments. I'm upfront with the women I date, yet each one thinks she'll be the one to fix me. But something always surfaces that convinces me a lasting relationship isn't in the cards. I work with a therapist, and we're working on those trust issues. I now own a 3-bedroom house, fully paid for in cash. I still don't have much trust in banks, although my credit score has improved, thanks in part to my ex-father-in-law. Without me asking, he corrected his reports to the credit bureaus. Maybe I should have punched him at the start of our relationship. Then again, that probably wouldn't have changed anything. All things considered, I'm not unhappy with my life. Sure, I miss the closeness of a close relationship, but seeing so many marriages crumble around me, I don't feel out of step with the times. As the saying goes, life goes on.